So I am a writer, and I started by doing theatre. That was always what I was sort of interested in. And then I randomly started writing poetry. I mean, it wasn't actually random. My dad died. That's why I started writing poetry, as a way of kind of coming to terms with that grief. Like, I'd always journaled, I'd always processed things through writing. And then somebody once said, like, oh, that sounds like a poem. And I didn't realise that poetry was something that I could do. So that was really nice. And I did a night at In Deep, and kind of the rest is history. I very quickly after that won a slam that made me kind of catapult, and I was able to do gigs, and it was like a really immediate art form that I loved. Like, I was able to write something like on the bus on the way to the event, whereas with theatre everything takes so much time. It was like a really quick way to express myself, and at the time I really needed a way to express myself. So that's what happened. And then I started working in film, and I do a lot of teaching. I teach people how to be creative and how to find their own way through writing. And yeah, my life is like a patchwork quilt of lots of different activities. I think at the heart of me, I am a writer who writes about pain. I feel like pain was always the starting point for anything that I was making. Like, how do I understand this pain? How do I understand this thing that is fundamentally comes hand in hand with being human? And writing just so happened to be the form that was sort of immediately accessible to me at that time. So I think that that's how I found my way through it. And I've always made work autobiographically. Like, it's always been an autobiographical starting point that I've then worked back from to figure out, how best do I tell this story? How best do I frame this in order for me to understand it better, but also in order for other people to understand it and hopefully connect to it as well. Yeah, I mean, I always loved story. I always loved, I don't think I'm always the most poetic writer. I think I sometimes really rely on the truth, and I really rely on just saying things how it is in a really simple way, which I've never struggled with. I've always felt honesty is one of my biggest, kind of strongest points. But for sure, I was always interested in story. And I think growing up as an only child, I watched a lot of telly. I was always in front of the TV. And that just like kind of gets you really interested in people and humanness and character. And I was always just really interested in, what it means to be human and emotions. Like, I find emotions like fascinating as well. And I think more than having an interest in words, I had an interest in connection, and I had an interest in understanding, and language was always the way for me to understand things. The poem is always changing, and I think there's so many different stages of it. So the first thing that I do, and lots of poets are different, this is just my process, but I just write as much as I can on something. I just kind of vomit as much as I can out, and that's the first version of the poem. And then there's the editing process, which sometimes goes on for years, which has loads of different layers. Sometimes you do 100 drafts, sometimes you do 200. Sometimes it's almost ready straight away. It really varies. And then when you start performing the poem, it becomes something else. I'll perform myself a lot, and that will also be a way of rewriting. So I'll take little notes and I'll change it, because I'll figure out different sounds and different rhythms through the performing. And then when you bring an audience in, it gives it a whole different layer, because sometimes it's funny, you didn't expect it to be funny. Sometimes the rhythm changes. So every time you do it, the poem is morphing into something else. It's never sits still. The only time it sits still actually is when you put it in a book and it's kind of done and you send it away, and then actually you have no control over it. But I still believe that the reader is then sort of part of that writing in a way, because they give it meaning to whatever it means in their life, but you're just, as the poet, actually removed from that. It's the poem doing the job, not the poet. Yeah, I think the longer I've been working as a freelancer and the longer I've been doing like lots of different things, I've started to realize that there's actually seasons of being a freelancer, and there's seasons of a creative project. So sometimes things do feel very quiet and they feel like they're all kind of behind the scenes and you're like squirreling away on a project. Sometimes it feels like you're very exposed. Sometimes it feels like you'll never work again, and those are moments that you start to realize as an artist are actually time for thinking and planning, and they're a winter of some sort that you need to like be kind of thinking about what the next step is and also living life so you have something to write about. But yeah, the balance is tricky. I think the older you get, the more you realize how important it is to have routine, and at the moment I'm doing much more film rather than poetry, and I miss the poems, whereas when I'm doing poems I'm like wanting to do the films, and there's always this kind of tug, and I think the best way to do it is just to follow what feels right in the moment. I think that Scotland is a hostile place for artists to exist. I think that, I'm super lucky, middle class, privileged. I've always had a safety net, and still for me it feels really difficult. So I can't even imagine for people that have kids or caring responsibilities, people that come from working class families. Like, I just can't imagine how difficult it is to exist in the world as an artist, without the privileges that I've had, and it's still hard for me. I'm Irish, and I spend a lot of time in Ireland, and I see the amount of money and time and effort they put into their art, and actually that they've been doing that for such a long time. They realise that it's such an important export, and it brings people to the country, and it also benefits spirituality, community, learning, growth. And now they're at the point where they're producing amazing films, amazing poetry, amazing music, groundbreaking stuff. And it's just because they've been really well funded for, the last kind of 15 years. Whereas here, where it's getting worse and worse and worse, which means the funnel of art that we're going to be producing is going to be less interesting, safer. It's not going to have as much forward moving because we're so worried all the time about making money. Honestly, I think we need to rally together. I think we need to be loud. I think we need to put pressure on the Scottish Government, because the thing is about the Scottish Government is we give them a lot of media time. They come and meet us, and they meet the young people we're working with and being like, art is so important, it's so vital for everything. So they say all the right things, but then actually following through, I don't think they quite understand how devastating it is, not only to the culture, but actually to people's livelihoods. And the quality of the art is just going to get so diluted, and actually we're going to have something that we're not proud of. And then on the other side, if we're not getting funded by Creative Scotland, we're going to be funded by these big investment bankers, these banks, like all these sponsors that are the only people on the planet that have any money at the time. And that means that the work is going to have to be filtered through what they want to spend money on. So, you've got this really, really dangerous world in which artists are going to have to rely on funders that they don't agree with, or that are, fine-tuning what is put out there. And I just think it's devastating for the culture, but also devastating for Scotland and how we are going to be seen in the world. I mean, we're behind everyone in Europe, and it's just, it's something that we say we're proud of, but actually I don't see the follow through at all. Yeah, I mean, generally I have the idea first, and then it's like, what is that? Is that a film? Is that a poem? What is that idea? What am I wanting to explore? But I know quite quickly what it's going to be. I think, quite early on, I'm like, oh, this is going to be a play. This is going to be a film. But sometimes, interestingly, I'll write something in a poem and then it will come back in a screenplay, and vice versa. So the challenges I battle with daily are my concentration. For sure, I really struggle concentrating, especially if I have a big deadline. Timekeeping is difficult, and the art I find fine. I know now when to walk away from something if I'm really struggling with it and come back to it. But sitting at the laptop is hard. I'm always wanting to have a conversation or go for a walk or, sit on my phone. And I think that that's probably the biggest battle I face. And also, I think putting the work out there is hard. There's a real I always think it feels like a hangover, like when you put something out in the world and then the next day you're like, oh my God, I feel hungover with like embarrassment over that thing. So that's really tricky as well sometimes. What has failure taught me? So I have been thinking about this recently as well because, I teach a lot of workshops about how you have to make failure your friend when you're working creatively. And I realized that actually that's all very good and well when you're alone and failing, writing rubbish, writing bad in order to move on to the next bit. But I think failing in public is very different, failing on stage or failing to connect or failing to, set out what you wanted to do is harder. And that is something that I'm still sort of trying to be better at. But I think it is hard, because you put yourself forward to be judged, but you don't always like it, And I think being an artist and actually doing the Fringe really taught me this, is that it's really important not to take on the good feedback as well. So it's like you have to do it regardless of the good and the bad feedback. You just have to kind of plow through regardless, because if you always take on the good feedback, then when you get the bad stuff, it's just completely flips. So you almost have to be like, I'm just doing this because I have to do this. And all the noise around is just noise, it's just decoration. I always think of myself as like, you've got to be a tree and there's going to be wind blowing all the time and you just got to stand really strong in the art. But yeah, every time I have to learn that lesson again, it's still painful. The rejections are still painful, the judgments are still painful. But I think you do get better at it. And when the big things happen, you just have to be like, okay, like, that's great, but it's not a constant, And I think you do get better as that, the longer you're an artist. I think like the way I say it always is like, take your pen for an adventure. Like, don't set out to know what you're gonna do. Like, make sure you're making to not make anything. So one of the things that I love to do is I love to like do collages. Like, I love to like stick down things because really you don't really know what you're going to end up with. It's more about just kind of exploring and going forward. And I think that is something, like if you journal or if you paint or whatever it is, just make sure you have space where you're not planning on doing something. I think film is quite different. That's quite much harder to do because you always want the film to be a film, but leaving space within your process for your ideas to surprise you rather than being set on, oh, this is what it's going to be like and this is exactly what it has to be. Just to know that, the process is the part where you are sort of like excavating and new things come up. Do you know what? It wasn't tricky, but it took a long time. So I first went to a short course in script writing. I'd never done it before, and in screenwriting, sorry. And when we sat down, we got the list of films that we had to watch, and there was no women in any of the films. And I was like, wait a minute, there's no women in any of these films. And I realized that there was going to be potentially space for me to have like some new stories that we maybe hadn't heard. This is maybe 2016, so it's a while ago now, like 8 years. And I mean, things have really changed since then, actually. And then I did like several different screenwriting courses, and then I made my first short in 2021. So it was like a long time sort of coming. And I think what I've realized is actually if you have been training your creative muscle, that you can sort of transfer it into different art forms quite easily. It's not a million miles away to write a poem to make a short film. Like, they're quite similar. You're always trying to strip back to like the core message. You're trying to show visual things. Like in a film, you're picking like, a cutaway or an image that tells a bigger story. In a poem, you're showing something, a metaphor, or painting a picture within the poem. So I think that they're very actually very similar, and the editing process is super similar as well. It's all about layering, trying things in different ways. So I actually don't think they're a million miles away. It's just that in a poem, you're letting the reader paint the picture. You're telling them what picture they need to paint. Within a film, you're showing them the visuals, and they're having to create the meaning. So it's almost like a swap, which I think is quite interesting. I just like always loved film, always loved TV. I wasn't sure it was for me because I'd never went to film school or anything. But I adore film, and I've always loved it. And I think that, you know, some of my biggest learnings from art was watching films. Like Y tu mamá también, when I was like 14, was probably like my sexual awakening. It was on like Channel 5 at like 2 in the morning. And just like other films that have just, you know, totally rocked my existence of what it means to be human. And I was interested in doing that myself.